and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian. First up this week, build bike tracks, 15th of January 2015. Why are we all so ignorant? The problem isn't car and bike users. The problem is that our roads aren't made or designed for both. Our roads were made for cars, and because cycling has grown in popularity and used by many, doesn't mean you just throw them onto our car-friendly roads and say deal with it. Let's be realistic here. Bikes definitely slow our roads down, and we don't need our traffic to slow any more than it is now. We must build bike tracks away from main roads. Arcorea, Beaconsfield. Okay, so this has been a perennial issue here in Perth, and it's jumped up certainly within the last several weeks, is the matter of cyclists. My take on it is that you are absolutely correct that our roads were not intended for cyclists. Perth has grown as a car city. We barely give any thought to public transport, and we certainly don't give any thought to walking or cycling. That said, there's nothing particularly wrong with cyclists on the road. Your point is it slows down traffic, and I would actually say that this is a good thing. For Perth's long-term sustainability, we need to move away from our obsession with cars. We have one of the largest urban sprawls because we don't like high-density housing, and as a result of that, everybody has cars. One of the ways that we can actually assist in moving away from it is to have slower roads. If it was more painful to drive because the traffic was slower and the roads weren't as useful, we could couple that with public transport and encourage people to cycle more or use public transport more. This is precisely the kind of thinking that's used elsewhere around the world. So in cities where they actually try to encourage people to not drive as much, one of the things they do is to make roads less attractive. Not dangerous, but less attractive to motorists. Places like Amsterdam or Vancouver have done exactly that. And they've given over large sections to bikes and pedestrians as a way of discouraging people from driving. And as one prong in a multi-pronged approach, that works rather well. And I would actually advocate it here. The other thing is, if you think about driving, about half of the time you spend driving in an urban setting here in Perth is time spent stopped at traffic lights or stop signs. Literally half of your journey time is spent pretty much stopped. And so being stuck behind a cyclist and travelling at, say, half the speed you otherwise would is actually not going to increase your journey time by massive amounts. So a 10-minute journey might become a 12-minute journey or a 15-minute journey. And the difference between 10 or 15 minutes is not a lot for most people most of the time. So overall, actually, I think of it as a good thing. I don't particularly like cyclists as a general thing. But I also recognise that our obsession with being able to drive everywhere, whenever we want, the expectation that we should be able to park at the door with one person in the car at all times, never having to share cars, and to be able to drive at near the speed limit all the time. This kind of obsession we have with cars here is not sustainable. It's led to a city that is much less livable than it otherwise would be, and is, yeah, in terms of climate change, our obsession with cars is hardly sustainable. Next up, no freedom of religion. If Sharia Tahrir is right, letters 15th of January 2015, then how does he explain that, from the time of Muhammad until today, there has never been freedom of religion for non-Muslim citizens in places such as Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan? How is it that non-Muslims, such as Christians, Jews and Hindus, have to flee from Muslim countries with few remaining? We are meant to believe these are not terrorist regimes. They are just Islamic states simply following Islamic teachings, which include draconian blasphemy and apostasy laws as enshrined in Islamic scriptures. Name and address supplied. So this is in response to a Muslim apologist who had written in a fairly lengthy letter detailing the value of Islamic civilizations throughout history, trying to counterbalance some of the anti-Islamic stuff that had been written in. And basically what he'd done was point out that actually, historically, there have been many Muslim states which have been welcoming of religious freedom, have had a questioning and open relationship about Islam. In fact, this was known as the Golden Age of Islam. Historians all of the time all recognise this. It's not a big secret. It's just something that's not widely publicised. Is that while the Europe was in the Christian Dark Ages, which was a time where there were draconian blasphemy laws and apostasy laws, which were enshrined in Christian scriptures. At that point in the Middle East, we had the Golden Age of Islam, where this is where science flourished at the time. And in fact, many of the ancient Christian writings that we have, and the sort of the ancient intellectual writings of the Greeks, etc., survive to today because they were kept during that period by Islamic cultures in the Middle East. And this was, certainly compared to Western Europe at the time, the Middle East under Islam was much more open intellectually, much better place for non-believers, for religious freedom. That then collapsed at about this, roughly speaking, the same time that the Europe emerged from their Dark Ages. And now what we're seeing is basically the other way around. Islam is in its Dark Ages. And really, the kinds of barbarity that we're seeing in a lot of Muslim countries now are not that far different from the medieval barbarities under Christendom. There really is very little difference between the two. It just seems so anachronistic because the Christian influenced West has come out of that, and the Muslim dominated Middle East, etc., has gone into that. Part of this actually is really just comes down to Saudi Arabia. So the particular brand of Islam, which is very puritanical, anti-intellectual, anti-questioning, very strict dogmatic Islam, which is often Wahhabism, came out of Saudi Arabia, and it's really only because the Saudis are so economically powerful that they've managed to spring that into ideological and political power in pushing their particular puritanical brand of Islam onto other Muslim states. If Saudi Arabia didn't have all the oil and didn't have, because of that, the support of countries like the US and the rest of the Western world, it's quite possible that Islam wouldn't be the political, ideological, and religious kind of horror that it is at the moment, and that this wouldn't be as readily exported to other sections of the Muslim countries around the world. So yes, I agree that a lot of countries are like that, but they certainly haven't always been like that since the time of Muhammad. It certainly isn't a foregone conclusion that simply because something is Muslim it must be that way, because certainly plenty of Christian countries were like that themselves, and they managed to come out of it. And certainly Muslim countries for a long period of time were far more civilized than Christian countries were. So yeah, that's how Shahir Tarin would explain that religious freedom is quite compatible with Islam, depending on what form of Islam we're talking about. Respecting Christianity, 9th of January 2015. As a born and bred Aussie, I understand the discomfort, bewilderment and anxiety that we feel as we watch the terrorist activities happening around the world. Our leaders rightly take action to try to protect us from it spreading here. It would make a big difference, I believe, if we Australians as a whole were more committed to the faith brought here by our ancestors. Instead, we sit by and allow it to be ridiculed and undermined without raising a finger to protect it. I just saw a segment of Adam Hill's Tonight on Channel 2. In conversation with a priest, he blatantly poked fun at the Ten Commandments and concluded the tirade with a purely blasphemous portrayal of God. The audience roared with laughter. If any such attitudes were displayed towards the Quran or Islam, there would be an uproar of outrage, and I doubt it would be allowed on air. But to the Christians' God? Well, it's just a joke. After all, we're Aussies, aren't we? And anything goes. No, actually. We are multicultural, yes, but with a society and law based on Christian morals and standards. If we want to keep what we have, we need to truly honour God, seriously follow Him, walk in His ways. This takes courage and commitment. Have we got enough of it? J. Hall, Karrinyup. Oh, what an absolute load of rubbish. It is true that historically, people in the West, and certainly the white settlers in Australia, were Christian. The morals that he's talking about and the laws that govern our society are distinctly not Christian. The Ten Commandments, the first 4 commandments are commandments about worship and obeying of a God. Nowhere in our law does it say that we need to do any of these things. A whole bunch of other commandments have the death penalty for breaking them. Nowhere in our law do we have the death penalty. None of the moral pronouncements that Christians like to think are unique to Christianity actually are. All of them predate Christianity. All of the moral advancements that we have made as a society have been made despite our the Christian faith of the majority, not because of it. You only need to look at the Catholic Church and other churches, opposition to things such as birth control and gay marriage, to see that it is always the churches which are holding back the moral progress in society. That said, there are certain branches of Christianity here in Australia who are very moral and who see the morality of what they do as central to their teaching of Christianity. But the fact that they are not that not all churches are like that and not all Christians are like that belies the fact that it's not central to everybody's Christianity to behave in a moral manner. And so it's hardly that Christianity can lay claim to this kind of morality. Now, you're right to say that we definitely do mock Christianity a lot more than we mock Islam. And there's several reasons for that here. But the main reason is because we know Christianity. Most people in Australia are at least somewhat familiar with Christianity. And therefore, when we mock it, these jokes work. Adam Hills takes the piss out of Christianity because we know what the Ten Commandments are, broadly speaking, and when he mocks it, you find that funny. If he were to make jokes about the 5 pillars of Islam, doesn't matter how good his jokes are, we're not going to find it particularly funny because very few people actually know what they are. And so the main reason why comedians don't focus on Islam here is because we simply don't have many Muslims. You're right, though, that part of it is to do with the fear of Islam, and that Islam, some Muslim people do take it very seriously and would threaten violence on people who did make jokes about it. And I absolutely condemn that. Because I think that ridiculing and undermining religion of all stripes is absolutely important in society. And the fact that the audience laughed should tell you something, that Australian culture has moved on very much from the time of venerating Christianity. We are well beyond that. Even mainstream Australians, even the sort of your white, middle-class Australian people don't take religious very seriously. They don't take their religion very seriously. They don't take Christianity very seriously. And so you're right, anything does go. We are not particularly interested in honouring God. And that has actually made us a better society, not a worse society. All the evidence shows that basically there's a strong connection between countries doing well across all the sort of usual measures of health and happiness and well-being and wealth, and a lack of religiosity. As countries do better, people tend to be less religious, or maybe it's the other way around. People are less religious and they end up doing better. The only exception to this is the US. But then the US is a bit of a exception to many things. So yeah, I'm not going to respect Christianity, and I don't expect the society to respect Christianity, because generally not respecting Christianity is a good sign in societies. Next up, Pride and Dignity, 20th of January 2015. What wonderful sentiments expressed by Aboriginal elder Robert Isaacs with regard to Australia Day. Celebrate Australia Day, the West, 15th of January 2015. He calls on all Australians to celebrate with pride and dignity, while acknowledging that some Aboriginals would not want to celebrate it because it represents Invasion Day. It was a pity, therefore, that the article was cheapened at the end by giving over space to Noongar elder Ben Taylor to vent his spleen. Mr. Taylor, clearly a paid-up, card-carrying member of the Invasion Day Brigade, makes the usual comments about Aboriginal people being degraded and dehumanised, and at the end trots out that old "they took away our children" chestnut. Mr. Taylor, you should wake up every morning and thank your lucky stars that we rocked up in 1788. I am, however, on the same page as you that Australia Day should indeed be renamed Civilisation Day. And as for the children, the stolen generation should be renamed the rescued generation. Gary Carter, Leeming. Gary Carter, you make me sick. The sentiments you've expressed here are despicable. The official government policy, the official policy here in the colonies, just over 200 years ago, essentially amounted to genocide. Aboriginal people were treated as if they were animals. In many areas of the country, they were routinely shot and killed simply for existing. The colonial approach was exactly the approach that Hitler took in the invasion of Poland, that white settlers needed the land and the black people were an inconvenience, and so they were simply herded out of there or shot and killed. That was the official policy. As time went by, we somewhat moved away from that, but the official policy of the government here within the last 100 years was the White Australia policy, which was the official policy was that Australians were to be white. We were not to allow immigration of non-white people to Australia, and Aboriginal people were not considered citizens of Australia. They did not have full citizenship rights, they did not have voting rights, they were not counted in the census, they were considered to be fauna, animals, essentially, was how they were considered. Unless you think this is the deep and dark distant past, much of this did not change until the late 60s and early 70s here. Now, as a part of that was what is referred to as the stolen generation. This was an official government policy that said that simply being a child to Aboriginal parents was sufficient justification for the government to remove you from your parents. That your parents being Aboriginal was sufficient reason to believe that they would not or could not raise you properly. And so thousands of Aboriginal children and infants were removed forcibly from their parents and given to white parents to raise or put in orphanages, overwhelmingly orphanages. Now, there is some claims that this was done with good intentions. And you know what, at this point, I really don't care. This was a despicable policy, and what it amounted to was genocide. This wasn't the deliberate killing of Aboriginal people, which is what had happened previously, but this was a deliberate killing of Aboriginal culture. That is what it meant to be an Aboriginal person. We'd moved beyond seeing, well, the enlightened people in government had moved beyond seeing the colour of skin as indicative of Aboriginal people, and thought that you could wash the Aboriginal people, the Aboriginalness out of people by having them raised by non-Aboriginals. And the idea was very much to make these children into non-Aboriginals. Brown-skinned Australians, if you like, with no Aboriginal culture. And this didn't cease until the 1970s. That is well within living memory. There are many people in this country who, when they were born, were not citizens. Aboriginal people, people whose ancestors have lived here for 40,000 years, whose land was taken from them forcibly for no reason at all other than white people simply wanting it. That was it. The white people simply wanted it and did not consider the Aboriginal people to be people at all. Their land was taken, their relatives and families were murdered for no reason, on the flimsiest of pretexts. Sometimes they were removed forcibly from their parents and raised with no cultural awareness, and even the possibly well-intentioned idea that if you washed out the Aboriginal culture out of these people, that they would be able to integrate into white society was so stupidly short-sighted, because guess what? White society didn't accept brown people no matter how they'd been raised. And so what you ended up with is a bunch of people who were easily identified as physically Aboriginal, but without even the saving grace of having some cultural connection to their family. People who didn't know their parents, people who didn't know any of their family members. And this was being done, in people's, in living memory, not quite in my lifetime, thank God, but in living memory. Children were removed from their families. I mean, for no reason, simply because they were Aboriginal. And for you to suggest that somehow this was rescuing people, we see the effect of this. It's abundant in the Aboriginal population. So many Aboriginal people have no idea how to parent, because they themselves were not parented, because their parents were not parented, because their parents were removed from their parents and were raised in orphanages. And the level of abuse in state care is appalling. Here in WA, we've had... The government just took the step of just giving financial payouts to people simply because they've been in care. Because at that point they realised that there was no real point in trying to argue the case in court about who had or had not been abused. That basically they were just going to make payments. They were just going to pay money to pretty much every Aboriginal people who just happened to be in care, because the level of abuse was appalling. Basically everybody who'd been in care had received some kind of physical or sexual abuse. The way we have treated Aboriginal people in this country is a dark shame. A dark shame on this country. It's one of the worst aspects of Australia. And the fact that people defend it sickens me. Absolutely sickens me. Now, I agree with those Aboriginal people who say that part of what they think will help to integrate society is if things like celebrating Australia Day as the modern Australia, the Australia we want to be, where Aboriginal people are just as much Australian as anybody else, and that we don't let these horrors of the past be a thing of the future. And I accept that, and I appreciate that, but I also understand, just as they do, that for a lot of Aboriginal people, the pain and suffering inflicted on them by the Australian government and the colonies before that is not something that they can give up easily and quickly, and that actually society as a whole needs to be reminded of this. And I think Australia Day is a great day to remind people. I wholeheartedly support the idea that we should remember it as Invasion Day. That 1788 was when white people came to this country and was the start of 200 plus years of murdering, oppressing Aboriginal people. I think that's something we need to remember. And maybe if for 200 years we can treat Aboriginal people as well as we treat everybody else, if we can build a just and non-racist society, and we manage to do that for 200 years, then maybe at that point we can stop calling it Invasion Day and start calling it Australia Day. But the fact that this didn't stop until 40, at most 40 odd years ago, and that racism against Aboriginal people is still rife in our society, as indicated by letters like the one written in here, until that day comes, I will still consider it Invasion Day. Climate Alarmism, 20th of January 2015. 2014 comes to an end, and on cue we have scary climate claims, this time from NASA no less. It was the hottest year on record, they say, by 0.02 of a degree. But anyone at all familiar with the climate dogfight knows that figure is well inside their own error margins. So what are they up to? And why did the other major temperature data providers hang on to their hats? Could NASA be unaware that their own satellites, as well as others, do not have 2014 as the hottest year on record? Why did they do an opportunistic big splash over 0.02 of a degree noise from a patchy thermometer network? A temperature hiatus at the end of a warming phase will give us a run of warm years, which is what we have had since the mid-90s. I guess climate always did equal politics and money. Matthew Laig, Rolling Stone. Okay, so there's some truth in what he's saying there. At this point, we only have preliminary data out about 2014. The data is still being quality controlled, checked, and collated. And generally speaking, the way that the data that is relied on to judge whether a year globally is, how hot it is compared to previous years, is a average of 3 data sets, one of which is the NASA satellite data. And then there's 2 others, which are independent data sources, which are then averaged to produce it. Now, at this point, all the indications are that actually 2014 was the hottest year on record. Now, maybe it was only 0.02 of a degree out, and maybe that is within the margin of error. I couldn't see anything suggesting that, but this person obviously has better data than I have. If that's true, then all we'd be saying is that 2014 was the second hottest year on record for the world. That would still be a pretty big news story. So when I went looking, based on data that was a couple of years old, the 10 hottest years on record have all happened since 1998. The 10 hottest years on record have all happened since 1998, and 8 of the 10 hottest years have occurred after the year 2000. We are much hotter today than we have ever been since we've been recording temperatures, and this is much more of an anomaly compared to previous temperature records going back thousands of years. The scientific consensus, overwhelmingly, is that climate change is happening. Full stop. So this person's trying to suggest that climate change isn't happening. even most of the skeptics accept that climate change is happening, and the scientific consensus is that not only is it happening, but it's human caused. We are causing it. This is what all the experts say. Now, I don't know who you happen to be, letter writer from Rolling Stone, but you would have been one of a tiny dissenting minority. The temperature hiatus is over, and all the expectations are that the weather will be getting hotter, not cooler. So yes, we've had a slight pause in the increasing temperatures, and the expectation is now that it will get hotter. I could not find any credible sources that suggest anything else. The fact that 0.02 of a degree. The fact that you're quibbling over whether 2014 was the hottest or not quite the hottest on record suggests to me that you're missing the big picture here, that it really doesn't matter whether 2014 was the hottest or wasn't quite the hottest. It was only the third hottest for Australia, so it wasn't our hottest on record. Our hottest on record happened a few years ago. I mean, that's what all the data is telling us, that overwhelmingly it's getting hotter much faster than it should be. It's getting hotter for, as far as we can tell, overwhelmingly the evidence suggests it's getting hotter because of what people are doing. Quibbling about whether on, NASA's temperature readings, 0.02 of a degree, 2014 was the hottest or not, missing the point big time. And that's also why I would like to see us use cars less, and perhaps one of the most effective ways would be to make people so pissed off that they, prefer to take the bus. Anyway, that's it for this week. Speaking of hot, it's pretty hot today. At the moment it's about 38 degrees here, so fairly hot. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.